Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the weekly web show for student affairs professionals in higher education. We broadcast live on the Higher Ed Live network, and you can join us on Student Affairs Live every other Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time to join the conversation. I'm your host, Heather Shea Gasser, and I am pleased to be joining you from my professional home here at Michigan State University. And I'm fortunate to be serving as one of two hosts of Student Affairs Live with my good friend and colleague, Tony Duty. I'm also thankful for the assistance of Kelly McCarthy, who will be monitoring our back channel today. Today on the show, we're going to be discussing the current events surrounding the non-indictments in Ferguson and New York, resulting in the political movement most well known by the hashtag Black Lives Matter. I'll introduce you to the panelists, and we'll begin our conversation after I recognize our show's sponsors and their support. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with educational institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Student Affairs Live is also exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA's strategic partnership with Higher Ed Live calls attention to the pairing of innovative professional development delivery with the strength of a renowned professional association. ACPA publishes the Journal of College Student Development and About Campus. Join us in Tampa, Florida for our annual convention by clicking on the link that we're tweeting out right now. So today, in the wake of the non-indictments by the grand juries in the Michael Brown and Eric Garner cases, campus leaders have looked to student affairs educators to address the needs of the campus community by creating safe places for students, providing opportunities for faculty and staff to effectively engage in meaningful dialogue, and in some cases, student affairs leaders are called upon to manage or lead change efforts directly related to campus climate. On today's show, we're going to address this critically important and timely topic. I've invited four individuals, Dr. Stacey Wharton-Pearson, Dr. Paul Porter, Dr. Larry Roper, and Dr. Dafina-Lazarus Stewart to join this conversation about how we might work together to create spaces for discussion on campus about confronting racism. Please review the Higher Ed Live website with the link that we're tweeting out now for their complete bios. To begin today's show, I want to lay some context. I identify as a white woman, and I recognize the privilege I have as a white person in this conversation and how that impacts my perspective. Today's show challenges me and all of us who want to enter into real dialogue and move beyond the fear of saying the wrong thing. But that might happen. And I'd ask for grace from my panelists and from those watching if I do say the wrong thing. But despite any personal fear that I might have, more strongly is my conviction that we need to fight against the urge to stay silent or to silence ourselves or others and instead engage in an open conversation. All of us who work in higher education and in student affairs specifically need to talk about how we are personally impacted and how we can support students in their activism and create alliances across communities so we can work together to address racism and racial oppression on campus and in society. So thank you for the opportunity to bring this topic to Higher Ed Live, and thank you so much to each of my panelists for joining me today. As I just shared on a personal level, I want to also begin to open this conversation on a personal level with my panelists. And I know that on several discussions in various forums, including the weekly Twitter chat called SA Chat, many student affairs professionals expressed that they were unsure what to do with their own personal emotions in the wake of the non-indictments. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to share and describe what your own personal reactions were and how or if you have sought balance with your emotions and your role as an educator. Larry, I'd like to ask you to start.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me, and I'm really honored to be part of this really esteemed group. So I want to start with the personal reaction. First, I reacted as a father of an 18-year-old African-American male. And so having a son who's, even after the Trayvon Martin incident, you know, I just felt incredible pain. I felt a sense of panic. I felt fear. And you know, it was personal. It was fear for my son, but then it very quickly to fear for our world, and fear for the condition of our society. So that was the backdrop for me just the personal fear and the personal pain that I felt in the face of those incidents. Um, and then the challenge is to shift professionally, to think about sort of what do I do with that in my own professional context where I'm also trying to educate and support young African American men, trying to support our community in going through its own pain and grieving process. And the simple way for me, and maybe it's just a product of having been in higher education for more than 40 years and being through many racial episodes in our society, but what I've learned to do is to lead in a way that's informed by my pain, but that's not leading with my pain. And it's just that challenge of, because my pain, if I lead with my pain, then I'm going to lead with my rage, I'm going to lead with my frustration, I'm going to lead with my, and that's not a place from which I can teach. It's not a place from which I can create healing for others.
Wow. Thank you, Larry. Dafina-Lazarus.
Yes, thank you. And just to begin, also, as Larry shared, I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. Just to clarify for those who may be watching, the pronouns that I use are thee, them, and their. And to answer the question, after the Ferguson grand jury non-indictment was announced, I had watched it live from home with my daughter. I was immediately angry, just outraged and enraged, actually. A good friend had contacted me to invite me to talk it out with here, and when I got on the phone, all that came out were screams. Literally, I just howled and cried for like 10 minutes, just enraged. I was so angry. But then after the non-indictment in Eric Garner's murder in Staten Island, which I read from my smartphone in a New York Times breaking news alert during a class break. I was in the midst of teaching one of our doctoral core courses. I was just mute. I was speechless and bewildered and hauntingly not surprised at the outcome. I almost couldn't speak, but I had to restart class, right? And so I really resonate with and relate into what Larry shared about you can't lead, you can't teach from rage, you can't lead and teach out of pain. And so I had to shift gears and shift modes. And so I restarted class. When I did, I explained what had happened because I felt it was important to share. And as I did so, tears just started falling. And then there were students who were crying in the class. But I was in that moment as an instructor, as a teacher, so I did not allow myself to give into that. We talked about it in light of that day's topic, which was curriculum evolution in higher education. And what is it that, how does curriculum and what we teach and what we consider to be valuable knowledge for college educated people to have, to be relevant as we think about how people were processing and reacting to, and indeed even those who go into law enforcement. But for days after that, really, it was over a week. I was just numb. I didn't let myself feel anything. And it got to the point where I was frightened by how numb I felt. For about 3 weeks, I was physically tense also. I could feel it, the tension in my body, almost as though I was bracing for another attack. And when the numbness finally left or lifted, there was just this washes of waves of grief, and just deep sorrow, and helplessness for a while, to be quite honest.
Wow. Thank you. Stacey.
So, Heather, I was off for a minute. I had a problem with my connection, so I'm not quite sure where we are with the question. So if you could help me with that.
Yeah, the first question,
Great.
Your personal reaction.
So I like Davina, was numb and really flushed and overwhelmed about how I was going to negotiate this with my sons. I was fortunate to not be in the workplace either day or the day after either non-indictments, and I was personally grateful for that, to really have the space.
I think we're having some technical difficulties with Stacey. Stacey, can you hear us? I think Stacey might be frozen. We'll come back to Stacey in a second. Paul, do you want to take it from here and I'll reconnect with her?
Absolutely. Just like everyone else has articulated, Heather, kudos to you and to ACPA for hosting this, for making this opportunity available. I am honored to sit alongside people that I have read and cited and have so much just deep respect for. Like my colleagues have articulated already, was angry. I felt sad. I felt a fear that was very similar to Larry's, but different in the sense that Larry is fearful for his son. I felt fearful for myself. I am an African American male that lives in a town that is not heavily racially diverse, and I fear what happens now when I walk down the street. What happens when I have a bad day and I want to go take a walk and listen to loud music and maybe yell out some of the lyrics or sing out some of the lyrics out loud, or just be upset, you know. I think what really hit me was with Eric Garner was that he is not that much taller and not that much larger than myself, and it's always been a fear of mine, is not necessarily getting beat up but getting jumped. This notion of he's a big one, get him, 5 of us, 6 of us, that's what it's going to take, and you know, the idea of being choked out, scary. It's incredibly scary. I felt a lot of racial battle fatigue for the same reasons that Dafina-Lazarus articulated, that we've seen this happen before. I remember where I was, and I instantly thought of where I was during the George Zimmerman verdict. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember the Rodney King verdict. And I remember thinking to myself, well, par for the course. And that's what elicited an emotional response on my part. When it comes to that notion of balance, what I felt was alone, and I felt confused because I'm now, as a director of multicultural affairs, in a position where I have to navigate my personal and professional feelings, and I'm sure we'll have the chance to talk quite a bit about when are you not your job. I went looking for dialogue. I went looking for affirmation. I was fortunate to find it on Twitter. I was fortunate to find it through ACPA and the series of talks that Cindy Love has led. I was able to find it with some of my friends and colleagues that are of color and kind of have that personalized perspective. The last thing I'll say in terms of my feelings was that I was bothered. I was bothered that I had to seek affirmation, and I was bothered that in many ways that affirmation came from the hashtag that you mentioned, that Black Lives Matter. I've said this before. My life isn't a hashtag. This isn't policy. This isn't perspective. This isn't Donald Sterling saying something offensive. This is my life. And this is my life, not as a male, not as an African American, but how those two things intersect. And that's, you're not going to make me feel better by hashtagging. I appreciate it. I appreciate the acknowledgement. But my life's not a my life is not a hashtag, and hashtags don't mean care. That's what I felt.
Stacey,
so
welcome back.
You.
Do you want to go to I'll go to you next.
Okay, and so I think that all of the panelists have articulated some of the ways that I felt. I feel in those moments, both non-indictments, the cumulative impact of racism, and me having a trauma reaction to that, and so being afraid to go to the store, being aware of what's happening in that moment, being definitely afraid for my large, imposing black man husband and my boys that have similar body frames and what that means for their safety. And I really went to a place of home first and then moved to what does this mean for my campus? How am I going to help us have conversations? What do I need to name? And even feeling exhausted by the thought of knowing that both it was a part of my job responsibilities, but also because of my stimulus value, that people would and skill set, that people would look to me to help to lead us in that process. And so I am disappointed that I am not surprised. And every time something like this happens, I continue to be angry at my lack of surprise. I don't like that at all.
Wow. So that's a great segue, actually, what you mentioned a second ago about how, as I said in our introduction, we as student affairs leaders are often called upon, when incidents like this happen, to create safe space for students, to create opportunities for folks to engage in dialogue, and you each represent very, very different. If people took a chance to read the bios, a variety of different perspectives and positions on different college campuses across the country. I'm curious how each of you has seen this play out in your respective roles. Paul, do you want to start, Director of Multicultural Affairs?
First, I'm going to unmute. I'm going to speak from the perspective of a student affairs administrator.
Yes, the small things.
And from within the discipline itself, from within student affairs broadly, I think that the biggest change is that this has been an excellent opportunity for us to engage and console and mentor our colleagues nationwide. This is an opportunity for a broad and powerful dialogue. But on the flip side, fortunately or unfortunately, these instances, and I think this is the first instance, certainly since I've worked in higher ed, where the verdict has fallen during the school year. The George Zimmerman that took place in July, where a lot of campuses, or certainly my own, are relatively empty. What I've learned, what I've noticed, what I've observed is that instances like this bring multicultural affairs to the forefront, and it gives the opportunity for us to finally be part of a consciousness. But I think that consciousness is for the wrong reasons. I don't want people to die to feel as if what I do is a priority on my campus. And these people aren't on my campus. Eric Garner does not attend my institution. Michael Brown does not attend my institution. I don't need anyone harmed in order for someone to turn around and say, we really should pay attention to the way that we're treating men of color. We should think about some men of color initiatives. So not only is my life not a hashtag, my life is not a reaction. And that's what I feel. I feel as if the attention that we have gotten has been reactionary. Why can't we proactively care about marginalized populations? Why do we have to wait for people to die? I hope that that's just an emotional reaction, and that across the board individually there have been some more level-headed and pro-actionary responses, but I can't forecast that. I can just hope.
Dafina-Lazarus, as a faculty member.
So, yeah, for me, this played out somewhat differently, right? Because I'm not a student affairs educator in that kind of formal role, but I am currently the co-advisor for a Black Student Union. here at BGSU. And the night that the Mike Brown non-indictment was announced, the president of BSU called for a rally and march on campus at 10 p.m. I got the text from my colleague who is in student affairs, Tobias Spears, who co-advises with me at like 10:15. It did not occur to me not to leave my house to get there. I live 5-minute walk from campus. And so I grabbed my coat, I flew out of the house. And I went and I marched and I chanted with them, and at the end spoke to the students who were gathered. The next day, the BSU held a noonday rally. I had class at 1 o'clock. I went to the rally at noon and marched with them, and was interviewed by one of our Toledo news stations about why it was important that students were out here and showing support. And then, so as I mentioned, I had class. This was the week that we went out for Thanksgiving break. And so I had class that Tuesday afternoon, the day after, and I had just been at this rally, had been up late the night before with students. My voice was practically gone. I held class. I didn't mention a word of it in that class because I didn't think I could make the shift. Because I knew my emotions were too intense. And so we did class as usual. But then the following week, as I already mentioned, we had class again, and that time I chose a different approach. And I think, both of those responses were appropriate and valid and legitimate, because I think we also have to recognize our need to do self-care in the midst of all of this. The university, for its part, like I said, this was the week that students left. We didn't have class on Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, and by Tuesday afternoon, the Access, Diversity, and Inclusion Unit within our Division of Multicultural Affairs, which includes the specific offices of Multicultural Affairs and our TRIO Programs Office, had put together a series of discussions open to the campus community for the week following break. And it was announced by the president before the students left for break that this was happening. There were, I think, 4 discussions that were held. They were each facilitated by a staff member from Multicultural Affairs on campus. And so I found that organized institutional response to be very important. About 40 to 50 to 60 students showed up to any of these 4 conversations. I was in one just as a participant. I wasn't facilitating the dialogue, I was just there, and I think that's important as well, that we don't always have to be the ones running things to be engaged and participating in the conversation.
Stacey.
So I'm going to pass in the interest of time and let Larry go, and then I'll chime in at the next question.
Sounds great.
Okay, it's great. This is really interesting. When this happened, I was actually on sabbatical. As I was transitioning from a vice provost for student affairs role to my role as a professor in the School of Language, Culture, and Society, where I'm coordinating the social justice studies program. So I was certainly thinking about all of this through my new role as a person who's going to be teaching core courses as well as supervising internships for students who are doing the social justice studies minor on our campus. But just from a student affairs perspective, in terms of the role of the chief student affairs officer, I think it's really important that we are the people who give voice to the campus's approach. That we are sort of part of those, that we are part of that convening of that important conversation. But the important thing, I think, is that we frame what is the conversation that we're bringing people together to have. Because I think if we just sort of randomly bring people together and say, just talk, we leave people leaving there in worse condition than they came in. And that our goal has to be that people leave these conversations in better condition than they came into them. And so our skill at convening and designing conversations is really important. I think fortunately on our campus we have what they call safe spaces, in that we actually just built 4 new cultural centers on our campus. And so we have some convening spaces to be able to bring people of affinity groups to be able to have those conversations, but also spaces in which we can invite others to have these important conversations. So student affairs really needs to frame the conversations, and we need to convene those conversations.
Fantastic. Thanks, Larry. Larry, I'm going to actually continue on that vein with you and also talk a little bit about policies and practices. As the Vice President for Student Affairs, can you talk a little bit about what practices and policies have helped in our efforts to create inclusive and equitable environments for students of color, what does not help, and what can be done at all levels, but particularly at the SSAO level and presidential cabinet level to change these policies?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Again, maybe it's a product of having done this for so long, is that the policy piece, quite frankly, is the easy piece. It's easy for us to come up with rules and codes of conduct and what we see as sort of the boundaries that are enforceable by an institution in terms of what to do. It's the practices piece that's our challenge. And the practices piece, quite frankly, it all grows out of sort of the role of the U.S. Constitution because of our inability, quite frankly, to have policies around people's ability to inflict psychological, emotional, and spiritual hurt on people with the things that they say. So whether we have rules around whether you can, engage in certain kinds of behaviors or whether or not certain kinds of, certain acts are permissible is one thing. But it's oftentimes it's sort of the daily interactions that create that sort of progressive hurt for people. Those day-to-day chronic hassles that over time wear people out and wear people down. And so I think our biggest challenge and our biggest practice is, do we have the campus ethos that we give people sort of a set of values, a set of behaviors, and we give them a daily frame through which they will live in relationship with others? And is that modeled by the people who are in leadership roles? So how do I show up every day? How do my colleagues show up every day? And what do we show people is permissible in regards to the humanity and the dignity of others? And I think that's the place where we have the biggest challenge in terms of transforming our institutions. I don't think that, quite frankly, I think the policy piece, we can sort of rack our heads around that and make that, like we can create rules, but it really is around our day-to-day interactions and our day-to-day behaviors.
Fantastic. We've had a couple of questions from Twitter, so I would like to definitely put out there that if folks have thoughts or comments, insights they'd like to share, or questions for our panelists, please tweet using the hashtag HigherEdLive. My next question is for Paul, but there are a couple of questions from Rachel Luna that came in over Twitter that I think are really relevant. Paul, protests and other forms of student activism are important expressions of personal convictions. And we in Student Affairs often help students organize and be effective at organizing. What level of involvement can we personally have? And then the question from Twitter also was from Rachel. Her university is hosting a die-in today. What are some tips for encouraging dialogue, and how do we support action beyond demonstrations? So that's a lot in one. I'm sorry, I'll repeat parts if you need me to.
No, it's okay. I think the key word is organize. And it's a key word because I think that our role, particularly as administrators, is to help our students organize their thoughts, help them organize their emotions and their intentions. Let's help them figure out who and what they're mad at, what has happened, and more importantly, what do they want done from their activism. If it's as simple as they're feeling alone, then maybe we create counter space for them and then move outwardly at a later time. Let's let cooler heads prevail. If that's not the case, if real activism is necessary, we find ways to mentor, and we go kind of back to the loop of these suggestions. When it comes to our level of involvement, I think that's tricky, and that's tricky because there's I think a delicate balance of person and profession. When are we not our jobs? And for some of us, I know for myself, I can't just walk out of this office and stop being Dr. Paul Porter, Director of Multicultural Affairs. I'm still black. I'm still male. I still care about these things, even when I leave. I'm still listening for microaggressions. I'm still combating racism. I'm still combating sexism and homophobia, all those things. And as a result, I think it becomes the question becomes, which hill do you want to die on? That, I think, makes it tricky for us to speak out and to take a level of involvement at all. So that's a great question. It's a tough one to answer.
Yeah, that is definitely tough. Dafina-Lazarus, you're a faculty member at a professional preparation program, and you've talked a little bit about that role particularly. I'm interested in what we are doing to help create educational opportunities to prepare the future student affairs educators for having conversations with students around these issues. I know we have a couple of classes watching today, so
Sure.
Tell us what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I wonder, there are three things I wonder about in response to that. I wonder how tangible we are making it for students in our graduate preparation programs. And not just master's students going into entry-level positions, but also doctoral students who may be seeking to advance into upper management and senior level posts, who will have the opportunity to discuss, as Larry did, about not just policies, but how policies are implemented in everyday practice. I think programs do have discussions with students, particularly in the master's curriculum, through the lens of discussing cognitive and moral development theories, for instance. But how those, I wonder if we're doing enough to ground those conversations about how we can spur more complex forms of meaning making may actually show up. So this is what could actually happen. Here's a case study of what could actually happen on your campus to really make it real for students. And so that's what I mean by tangible. I wonder how tangible we are. And particularly at the doctoral level curriculum, when we talk about classes maybe around administration, or a class on organization and governance, or a class on leadership, higher ed leadership, how are we actually engaging folks in tangible conversations about actual situations that could impact their work? I also wonder if we're having necessary conversations about what Paul just spoke about concerning student affairs educators' roles in working with student activism. Really digging into issues of ethics and values, so thinking about loyalty, affiliation, do no harm, doing good, and educators' professional responsibilities as institutional actors in these situations, while also maintaining a sense of integrity, personal integrity, about who they are and what they value. And finally, I wonder if we're giving enough room for emerging and continuing student affairs educators and professionals to consider who they are and what their values are when these kinds of issues come up, to be prepared for the when, not the if, okay, and where they're going to step into the conversation, you know. Those are the three things that come to my mind.
That's great.
Hi, Heather. This is Larry. I'd like to jump in. And
Sure.
I also teach in our preparation program, and I think that this is a really important area. I think professional formation, particularly values and behavioral formation. One of the things that we do in our program that I think is really helpful, and actually I want to give kudos to our former Dean of Students, Mamta Akapati, for starting it. But we begin our preparation program with students going on a social justice retreat. And we use that as the basis, and we want that to be the frame in which they enter our program. And so we try to embed in our courses constant opportunity for them to do critical analysis and engagement, and to be able to look at all the work that they do through a social justice frame. And so I think that's something that's really important. The other thing, and it's just a really concrete example, is a class I started teaching. I started teaching a year ago, and actually it was initiated by our graduate school, asking me if I would teach it. It was a course called Intervening the Isms. And it was a course that actually introduced students to the isms, and then they had to actually engage in and create a project to intervene into a very specific ism that they identified on this campus. And so it's a practical application of their awareness into institutional change. And I think that our biggest challenge is to teach people to take what they have as values and beliefs and to learn behaviors that can take those things and transform them in real ways.
Mm-hmm.
Great, that's great. Stacey, you work as a director of a counseling center. Can you talk a little bit about, from that perspective, what psychological impacts you believe are happening, and how these things in society end up impacting our students, and what we can do regarding the media coverage and all of that together?
So I think that the 24-hour news cycle is something that has really changed the way that we interact with what's happening social historically or social culturally, and that whether they are repeating a video or a mindset or whatever, that those things allow people to almost continue to be re-traumatized over and over and over again. The best example that I can give of that is 9/11. And how many times we all watched those towers fall. There was a moment that I stopped that. So I think I may have watched the Eric Gardner video 3 or 4 times, but then I was like, okay, that's it. Like that's not good for you to be doing that. I also think that we can use the media outlets on our campuses to help students frame what their reactions are and normalize and not pathologize when they are feeling anxious or when they're experiencing healthy cultural paranoia, that people are more heightened during times like these of the non-indictments. And so to normalize that and not pathologize that either at the tables of our meetings and when we're talking about that, also, but when we're talking with students. I also think that we have to help students to take care of themselves too. And it's something as simple as don't read the comments on any social media. If somebody puts up a video, do not, and it's a practical thing because part of what happens is that, again, people end up being re-traumatized around that. What we have found, or what I've found, is that people are more aware of microaggressions and are more heightened by that than they would have been during before the non-indictments, and particularly when they came back to back the way that they did, and we see that as normal as well. I am curious and thought about this today about how the media covered the Ferguson fires versus the fires on Monday night in Columbus.
Yeah.
And really, in ways, the media continues to kind of reinforce what the dominant narrative is around different behaviors for different groups. And so how Michael Brown was literally called a demon by Darren Wilson, and that notion of 3/5 man, and this group of people are violent and they need to be harnessed by and policed in a way that's different than for others. And so I think that that's some of the impact, both of the media and how people are kind of trying to live into this. It's interesting, I will share this, that in talking about this today, I found myself feeling tearful again. I thought, whoa. And so that reminds me that we're all still living into this and trying to deal with what this means, even though it's not necessarily new.
We had a great question from Twitter. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your thoughts on this. Dr. Zeb Davenport asked, I think it's his class actually, one of the classes that's watching today, he says, what can we do to prepare future essay pros to be ready to act? Conversations are great, action is vital. Dafina-Lazarus, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. And I want to start this by saying I really appreciate where I believe that question comes from. But I think that this idea of moving from conversation to action sets up a false binary, actually. There's no point when it's okay to stop talking and just be all about taking action. And I think sometimes, particularly in student affairs, I've observed us as having a really kind of funky attitude towards spending time in discussion and contemplation and reflection. We need to keep talking while we're acting, right, to make sure that we're still on track with our goals and values and things are still rolling out as we intended to. I think talking to different people is important. Groupthink eventually develops when the same group of people, even a group that may be racially or gender or sexuality or racially religiously rather diverse, are working together on a project, an activity, an event, a response to an issue for an extended period of time. And so inviting external people into the conversation can help expose blind spots, I think, and ask through their asking of critical questions. And so I've been playing all this academic year with the imagery and metaphor of seesaws, and that there's a need, seesaws or cycling, continuous cycle of conversation and action, conversation and action, conversation and action, where as we are acting, I think as Schoen talks about the need to practice reflection in practice, okay, so that we're allowing adequate time to mull plans and ideas for action, because I think, there's this neoliberal epic that has infected our society and higher education also right now, brings this neoliberal value of efficiency. We need to act, right now, we need to do this, and focuses on action to the neglect, I think, sometimes of contemplation and reflection and dialogue, which can end up leading to ineffective actions because they're too narrowly conceived, or even actions that end up deepening oppressive outcomes. Right. And so again, I envision this as a seesaw, or as a cyclical process of conversation and action that is inspired and informed through conversation with an eye toward action, right? So, and I think maybe that's where Zeb is coming from. It's like, how can we engage in conversation with an eye toward action, right? And I think it's about, asking the questions, well, what does this mean? If we take seriously the things we are saying here in this dialogue, what then should we be doing differently? And asking that question in the midst of our conversations, I think would be really important and helpful. I'll yield the floor with that.
Other thoughts from other panelists?
Yeah, I think that it's. I really appreciate the question, Zeb, and I really appreciate the ethic that I've seen you demonstrate around this and action. I think it's really important that we prepare student affairs professionals from the inside out, and that your preparation for action and the quality of the action that you take is going to be driven about what's going on inside of you. And I think part of that is going to come out through the kind of conversation and dialogue that Dafina described, that we've got to prepare people to be able to engage. But we also have to have people pay attention to their own inner landscape. Sort of like, who am I? Why am I here? What am I hoping to get done? Sort of what kind of emotional and psychological weight am I carrying? And how does that prepare me to live in just and equitable ways with others? How does that prepare me to lead? Who does it allow me to be in relationship with? Whose story does it allow me to hear? And because those are the actions of student affairs work, is hearing people's stories and responding in meaningful ways to those stories. It's about looking at campus incidents and episodes and having a meaningful response to those. Well, that's going to be influenced by who you are and what's going on inside of you. So I think it's just that combination of things that Dafina described, that it really isn't a dichotomy. And so the conversation is really part of the cultivating preparation for the action.
Great. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk more macro level for a moment, because I want to get to this issue of what is at the crux of the problem. These incidents are all symptoms of a larger problem in our society, and I'm curious from each of your perspectives in just a short, 1-minute response, what is the problem? What is the crux of the problem? Larry, do you want to start?
Sure. In a minute. So I think the major issue, if I had to summarize it in a very simple way, is a historical legacy of miseducation, stereotypes, and fear that are embedded in our society and individual consciousness. And I think that mix of power, fear, and ignorance is toxic. And that the root of our problem in society is the degree to which our social institutions and individuals within those institutions have been able to function with that toxic combination, again, of fear, power, and ignorance, are able to function without examination, interrogation, or interruption. And that at some point, our challenge is, how do you declare a breakdown? That we have had a breakdown in our society, we've had a breakdown in our institutions, and how do we now reclaim the soul of our society and our social institutions? So we've got to name it, and then we've got to claim responsibility for it. And as educational institutions, the most powerful tool that we have at our disposal is education. And how do we use our education as a social transformation tool?
That's powerful. That was powerful. Stacey.
So for me, I believe that it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the dominant narrative. And the dominant narrative has different things to say about different groups. That one group is better, that one group should have privilege or does have privilege, and that privilege is earned when maybe it's unearned. And it is up to that group to and that the other group is criminal and or demons or have anger that they may harm me or hurt me or criminals. And because of that, they are dangerous. And maybe even back to our history of African Americans being 3/5 man. And that we have to continue to do things to interrupt that, both individually and intrapersonally, but also the same is true interpersonally as well. And until we're able to really kind of own that and really aggressively look to shift that as an entire nation, I think we will continue to see incidences like this.
Paul.
I think the crux of the problem is comfort. The actions that are leading to the deaths that are leading to these conversations, the fact that they've happened repeatedly, the social narratives, the sociological narratives that exist, that the media depictions of the individuals who have lost their lives versus those that have taken them. The Ferguson versus Ohio State, I think, is a very, very powerful example of the narrative that gets created and thus makes it easy to allow the problem to maintain itself. I think institutionally, the ease that this will all just blow over. We talked about that hashtag. I don't see that hashtag as much as I did a month ago. The fact that we talk about, discussion and conversation and reflection to action, I think to some degree there's a comfort in knowing that we can just buzzword it away. And we can throw out all of that jargon, and eventually people will surrender to the bureaucracy. There's safety in numbers. There's a foundation that can lead to a comfort, and that comfort is where the problem lays. It needs to be uncomfortable to be silent. It needs to be uncomfortable to be a bystander. That's where we're at.
Dafina-Lazarus.
Sure. So when I thought about this question as we were getting started, I actually wrote what I think is perhaps just a tweet size response. I think what all of my colleagues have said thus far comes down to perhaps this. What's the crux of the problem? The problem is systematic structural racism bolstered by other systems of oppression, but held isolated from them and commoditized for profit by capitalism. That's the problem.
Okay.
Wow.
And to me, that's the problem. You know,
Good.
That's good.
Was that 140 characters?
I think that might have been
no,
a
it might be.
We could abbreviate. Wow.
Is there a collection plate? Because you have all taken me to church.
It's 145 characters, but I think a really clever Twitter user can abbreviate some of the things to make it 140.
And go.
And go. Wow. So when I think about all of those issues, I mean, you all were incredibly articulate. I mean, I said a minute, but I think you all were just really captured it. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with our capacity within student affairs to help unlearn racist socialization, right? Mm-hmm. So what can we offer? What can we offer as a better response to or support of those folks who have been victims of racial profiling? And this can play out at the institutional, the individual, and the larger societal level.
So I think that what you did at the beginning of this call, Heather, was masterful, to own that you might make a mistake or you might step in the poop, and if so, that we would deal with it if needed to be, and to ask for grace. Mm-hmm. I think it's important for people to know that we all have grown up in this society. If we have all grown up in this society, that's an assumption, but that racism exists, and each of us is a little racist. Some of us may be a lot more, but each of us have some of that in them, whether it's internalized racism for myself or externalized for somebody else who holds a different set of social identities, but that is just what's the case. And because of that, sometimes your intent may not equal your impact. Because oftentimes what I find that happens is when people step in the poop, that they get stuck and caught because that's not what they meant. Who cares? It is how it impacted that person. And I think fear of doing or saying something racist oftentimes keeps our allies silent, apathetic, and lethargic. And that is maddening, because who wants to hold all of the responsibility for your own social identity group? Speak up. Nothing irritates me more is being in a room and something horribly racist or some type of microaggression happens, and then people come up to me after that meeting to share their reaction. Who cares? It's you could have used your power in that moment to change that for me, to lessen the cumulative impact that I talked about earlier. And so it would take the responsibility off the target group. I am a straight ally. I will continue to use my privilege to interrupt the experiences for my gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. And the same is true for those that are walking out gender identity issues, my Latino brothers and sisters, Asian American, and those that are walking or dealing with some type of disability. That's what I want. Like that's my Christmas wish for Santa to bring down the chimney. Now, here's the thing. When you do step into the poop, which you will, it is impossible. You just own it, embrace it, just know it, right? Listen, take ownership, apologize, and don't do it again.
Dafina-Lazarus, you have something you want to share on this?
Sure, and Stacey has me over here ready to shout. So I'm gonna try to pull it back together. But following really right along with what she has named, it requires, I think, among student affairs educators, that our responsibility is to educate everyone on campus. Okay, so this idea that victims and perpetrators are mutually exclusive and oppositional categories needs to be disrupted, which is exactly what Stacey was talking about, right? We have to recognize and understand the ways that internalized and horizontal oppression show up and show out on our campuses. And so we all have unlearning to do, because we have all been socialized into a society that is racist, sexist, practices compulsory genderism, ableism, ageism, classism, all of that, right? Consequently, people who are members of targeted group, or who have targeted or marginalized group identities, have internalized oppression that needs to be rooted out and dismantled as well. And so assuming that people who have racially minoritized group identities or any other minoritized group identities have all the answers and automatically possess some super complex, critical, and well-informed perspectives on issues of oppression is a fallacy that actually works to reproduce and maintain systems of oppression and privilege.
It's true.
Wow. Paul.
You know, I don't have a master's in student affairs, but I feel like I'm getting one now. I feel like I should be taking notes, and there should be a test after this. Heather, I was blown away to read your preface and to hear your preface and to ask for grace. That is the most humble and I think heartening thing I've ever seen. And oddly enough, when I read it, I thought to myself, you are a white woman, but you're a white woman in context. And in our context, student affairs, you're the one with power, quantitative and qualitative. And by power, I mean that on a regular day, on just a typical Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever day, who's controlling the conversation? Who dictates when we get to talk about race and social justice? Think about what we talk about on a regular basis within the context. Who's driving that conversation? And quantitatively, there's some populations that outweigh others. For those of you that fall into those populations and those contexts are completely fluid and different, keep in mind that you have discursive power. You drive the conversation. You're the one that gets to bring it up. When I talk about race, there's the, here he goes again. But when someone else does it, people might stop and listen. Know what you own in your context.
Larry, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just really quickly. I think that it takes a lot of courage to use your power in search of justice. And particularly as a white person, it's a very difficult thing to do, because in the process of doing that, you may, from a full place of commitment, say something that's wrong, or say something that's heard as wrong. And in that moment, you've created for yourself a career-ending opportunity, because we've seen it and we know what happens. And so part of it means that those of us who are in the conversation with those who are seeking justice at a risk to their own well-being need to truly demonstrate the grace that you've spoken about, Stacey. Because what I think we have to accept is that as we function, all of us function at less than our full human capacity and with less than our full humanity being engaged as we interact with others. And our biggest challenge is how do I bring as much as my humanity as possible to bear as I am working with others to try to get us to a better place.
Yeah. My question, kind of drawing upon where we've gone with this last little bit, has to do with this concept of silence. I know that silence by some inhibits our ability to enter into real dialogue with one another, because I think that's another important part of this conversation. It's not just about with our students or with our colleagues on our campuses, it's within our own personal lives. How can we assist those who may feel unable to engage for whatever reason, their race being one of them, to not engage or not be a part of this dialogue? And how can we make sure that we all understand the implications of choosing not, as an action, choosing not to participate in the conversation? And part of it might be out of fear of saying the wrong thing. And I think, Stacey, your point earlier is really well taken here, that sometimes you're going to do it and say you're sorry, move on, don't do it again. Do you have further thoughts on that, Stacey?
I think I really appreciate what Larry just said about the risk and that can be career ending. I think the balance side of that is grace, but to not overly objectify the perpetrator. I think if we could accept that we all are a little racist, that it would be easier for us to accept that mistake. And so I think that that's important. I also think that it's important to remember that being fully inclusive and living in a more socially just world is a journey and not a destination. And that we should provide folks the opportunity to have these difficult dialogues and conversations. When I was at the University of Michigan, there's a program there called Intergroup Dialogue, or IGR, which is actually part of the anchor for the Supreme Court argument around affirmative action for the university. And part of what they teach the students who are part of that program is how to have the skill sets that they need to have these difficult conversations. And students come out with both the content knowledge of what it's like to be an African American woman and a white woman. That is one dialogue class, but also so they have the content piece, but then they also have the skill set that allows them to practice how to have difficult conversations and have those conversations be actual conversations and not shouting matches, how to share the floor, how to interrupt your privilege, and what that ought to look like. And that skill set could be valuable not just for conversations around social justice, equity, and inclusion, but just conversations across the board.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move to our final thought for today because I recognize we're at the hour. Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr.'s official birthday. I know many campuses observe this day next Monday. Tomorrow's his actual birthday. So this is a really timely topic for this time of year. But we don't want the conversation to just occur around MLK's birthday. How do we make sure that this is sustained, that this dialogue is sustained, that our campuses continue, and that we as student affairs educators within our spheres have the ability to keep the conversation going? Dafina-Lazarus, we'll start.
Thanks, Heather. I think, and this was referenced earlier, I think Stacey referenced the 24-hour news cycle. And so as I think about how do we sustain the conversation, I think we can't allow that 24-hour news cycle to dictate when and how we have these conversations. Racism is happening every day, just like other oppressions are systematically a part of everyday life, and so should be part of our consciousness every day. And to people who might say, well, gosh, that sounds really exhausting. Try living it.
Right.
Right.
I think
Amen.
You know, exhaustion is not an excuse for disengagement, you know, and so how can we, just as systematically as racism is practiced every day, how can we just as systematically focus on how to dismantle it daily? I think also is recognizing how systems of oppression interact and are interdependent on each other for their perseverance, okay? Such that a single set of actions can lead to greater emancipation along several fronts: race, gender identity, sexuality, social class, disability, etc., not just one. So as I listen to my other colleagues talk about their roles as parents, and I'm a parent as well. I'm a parent of a teenage girl. And I'll tell you, I was just as worried and concerned for her as those who are parenting Black sons, okay? Because the police kill unarmed Black women too. Right? And even though those stories don't make the 24-hour news cycle, that's what I said before about we can't let the 24-hour news cycle dictate when, how, and what we talk about. We need to have a recognition of the interaction and intersection of systems of oppression, and how then to have these conversations in ways that do not create a hierarchy of oppressions or assume that we can isolate it in an isolated manner, focus on what we're going to cure racism today, and then tomorrow we can get to your gender identity stuff and heterogenderism, and then on Monday of next week we'll deal with classism, and in March, because it's Women's History Month, we'll deal with that. No, that's not effective, right? the task is big. It can be broken into smaller chunks. The key, I think, is to keep the end goal in mind as the larger picture, and not allow ourselves to be dictated to by the media, by popular culture, by other external forces about what to focus on and when, and to do it in an isolated manner. There's a recognition of how we can be allies and engage in coalition across groups, across issues, okay, to support each other's emancipation and liberation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Stacey.
So I think that my institution, my current institution, Susquehanna University, that I've been at it all of 3 days now, has a really interesting program coming up this semester that they're having a activist in residence, and bringing in somebody to work with our students for 3 weeks on how to operationalize some of their feelings, thoughts, reactions around activism, but also then how to plan and implement programs that allow them to respond effectively to their environment. And so I love that idea, and that's a program that is set that they do, that we do here every semester, and I think that is pretty neat. I also think that there is value in doing some preemptive or preventative work that both the incident in Ferguson and the incident in New York and Florida and on and on and on have frequently been with law enforcement. And so I think it's important to try to figure out a way to build a relationship with some of our communities of color and our university police departments, and do it in a way that doesn't overly point the finger at the police as being wrong, but also doesn't put our students in a place that they feel even more reactive or angry with the relationship with the police. And I think that there's also value in bringing in other forms of media. I think the movie Selma is a wonderful way to continue, right now at least, to engage, or even Dear White People, to engage our students in continue conversations around issues of race and ethnicity.
Great. Paul.
I'm going to sum mine up in 3 words. No more silos.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a res life thing. This isn't a faculty thing. This isn't a multicultural affairs thing. This is the person to your left, the person to your right, in front, behind, diagonal, from 5 years ago, or the people that you're going to meet one day. This is a topic of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't. This is an everybody thing. Get out of your silos, because the rest of the world is waiting for you, and they need you.
Mm.
Thank you, Paul. Larry, final thoughts.
Sure. I think stops and starts are confusing. So when incidents happen, we treat everything that happens as a distinct and isolated conversation. It creates confusion. And I think our biggest challenge is to realize that all of this is one conversation with many different parts. And I think that's part of what Dafina was saying. That is all one ongoing conversation connected with our community's aspirations for itself. So who are we? Who are we trying to be? And what can we take from this that can help us to continue our movement in a positive direction to who we want to be? And I think the conversation needs to be framed around, are we looking at scanning the world based upon what we're trying to eliminate, or are we looking for opportunities to create? So are we looking to create community, or are we just looking to get rid of bigotry? And I just know that as a leader, for me, I prefer to create as opposed to exterminate. Because if I'm an exterminator, I have to inject something toxic in the world in order to get rid of a problem. But if I am an artist, I am creating something that is beautiful and that is life-giving. And so I think that our challenge around this is to frame it in a way about being really clear about what we're trying to create, and that this is all part of the same conversation.
Wow, on that note, that we are looking to create community versus just eliminate bigotry, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you to all four of you today. Fabulous episode of Student Affairs Live. I'm incredibly grateful for your time. For all of you who watched on Twitter today, this was there was a fabulous back channel conversation. I'd urge you to go back, look at the Higher Ed Live hashtag. Coming up next week on Student Affairs Live, my co-host Tony Duty, at a special time of 1:30 p.m., will be talking with the leadership of ACPA and NASPA about the failed consolidation 4 years later. And this show is going to be pretty exciting as well. Both executive directors and current elected leaders will be joining. So you can receive reminders about this and other episodes of Higher Ed Live by subscribing to our newsletter. You can browse our archives at Higher Ed Live, and this show will be posted for sharing later as well. Once again, thank you to my guests, thank you to my sponsors, and I'm Heather Shea Gasser, looking forward to seeing you all soon. Make it a great week.